Hello. There have been a number of interesting stories in the news this year concerning people whose religious convictions caused problems with their employers. Some Muslims working in Sainsbury's were reluctant to scan through alcoholic products. So Sainsbury's announced that they could raise their hands and ask a colleague to take over until the offending items had been checked. A Hindu airport worker was suspended and then reinstated after she was told to remove a nose stud. And the case is still pending of the Muslim hairdresser who's sued an employer because she wasn't given a job in a hair salon because she insisted on wearing a headscarf. The prospective employer claims that to employ her would have adversely affected her business. So have employers a responsibility to make allowances for the religious convictions of their employees? And should employees bring their religious convictions into the workplace, even when they may clash with the aims and objectives of the company they serve? Joining me to discuss religion in the workplace are Lord Brian Griffiths, Vice Chairman of Goldman Sachs and an advisor to the Christian Association of Business Executives, Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra, Chair of the Muslim Council of Britain's Interfaith Relations Committee, and Douglas Murray, Director of the Centre for Social Cohesion in Westminster. So, Brian Griffiths, do you bring your Christian faith into the workplace?
I think it's very difficult not to. If you're a Christian and your Christian faith informs a worldview and really informs all aspects of your life, of which work is terribly important, I don't think you can leave it at the door of a workplace. You really have to take it with you. And I would say it's something very positive. I mean, trying to help create the culture, for example, of a financial institution, which depends on integrity and trust and so on, bringing one's faith in is to me, an integral part of that.
But presumably it involves compromise, because as you mentioned, your business is money.
But you know, Jesus taught more about money than he taught about prayer. But I think it certainly involves compromise, because clearly there are going to be people there of different religions, and there's always going to be a struggle with the nature of human existence and materialism and the basic values of life and so on. But that's not a reason for not taking it in.
Ibrahim, you must be asked many questions by Muslims about work. Are some forms of work off limits for Muslims?
I mean, the first thing to say would be that for a Muslim, when he or she views religion, it's not so much Islam as a religion, but Islam as a way of life. So to divorce religion from yourself at the door of your place of work is absolutely impossible, not only difficult, because it's not only what your appearance is in the workplace, but also the attitudes that you carry with you that are formed by your religious beliefs and religious teachings. So I am approached many a times by people who ask me whether they can work in a bank or whether they can work in X, Y, or Z institution. And I try to give them the guidance as best as I can, depending on what we can foresee as possible scenarios in the workplace. And you never find me saying to a Muslim, yes, you should take up employment in a pub behind the bar, because I know that will be full of complications. But working in a superstore is fine. And when we go into the specifics of cases, I say to Muslims that do consult your imam and find guidance for yourself in your employment.
Douglas, do you have ethical principles which you apply rigorously to your work?
Well, look, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that you have to divorce your religion and your workplace to some extent. Workplaces cannot become centers of either proselytization or hypersensitivity. One of the things that happens every time the situation with religion in the workplace comes up in the news, whether it's the cases you mentioned or many others we could go into, one of the things that happens is that every single time the most extreme and sensitive interpretations of the faith in question becomes the norm. So really we have to divorce the private spiritual lives of employees and the situation they're in the workplace.
Well, I want to come to the specific cases a little later in the program, but let's go back to the basics. Brian, when you consult your scriptures, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, do you find that they have a positive attitude towards work?
I think they have an extremely positive attitude, because for a Christian, and I think the Christian view is very much based on a Jewish view, particularly on the Pentateuch. We live in a world created by God. We ourselves have been created in, the Bible says, in God's image. And God is a creator. He's a person who works. And work is therefore integral to what it is to be a human being, which is why unemployment is such a terrible thing when people have no work. So I would say from a Christian point of view, work is something very positive which gives people genuine satisfaction, and we have gifts and we have motivation and so on, and we really want to get to grips with work.
Ibrahim.
I mean, in the Quran, I find a very interesting verse that tells Muslims or encourages Muslims that on the Friday, when the Friday prayers are over, they're actually to go out into the world and work and seek their daily bread. So it's quite different, for example, for the Sabbath for the Jews and the Sunday for the Christians, where it's supposed to be a day of rest and prayer. For the Muslims, it's prayer and work combined together. And the blessed Messenger Muhammad, peace be on him, was very emphatic about the need for people to go out into the workplace and work. Whilst they're working, they are serving God, because they are helping to look after their families and their society, etc.
But you see, this is where we get to the problem, is that in Britain in the year 2007, we should not have to go to, and nobody should have to go to, seek Quranic justification for when they work. That is an entirely different project to that of working in a multi-faith and often no-faith society like contemporary Western society, which I think has one particularly great benefit, which it's taken centuries to get to, which is that we do separate the private life of faith and one's public life, that you can be a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or any other believer, and although that affects your personal life, your spiritual life, it is not something you take to the workplace, and therefore it is not something you should be doing to seek biblical, Quranic, or Torah justification for what you should or shouldn't be doing in the workplace. It's utterly irrelevant.
I'm at a total loss in trying to understand Douglas's argument. For a Muslim, the source of guidance is the Quran. I mean, it forms everything that I believe, and it forms my attitude. And that very Quran tells me also to take into account the sensitivities and the needs of others around me. And to suggest that a Muslim should kind of be a work person or a laborer within the workplace and not be Muslim is something that cannot be commemorated. I mean, a
I'm
Muslim...
saying it's something that all people should leave at the door of the workplace. It is not relevant whether a Muslim can find Quranic justification for something. The only justification in the workplace is what that workplace dictates.
And what Douglas,
Can I just
what
say,
if...
I really disagree here with Douglas, because it seems to me there are two separate issues. The first is, can I as a Christian go into the workplace and somehow leave my faith at the office door? And when it comes to discussing issues of global poverty or of integrity in financial dealings, can I neglect the source of what my values really are? I think I can't. I think it's impossible for somebody who's a Christian to do that. And I think that is totally different from saying we are therefore going to create a culture which is very oppressive, which makes unbelievers very uncomfortable, and which is a very sort of stuffy culture in terms of the company. And I want to distinguish those and ask Douglas, wouldn't he want to go along with some such distinction?
Yes, but the point is that you can express charity, you can express goodness, and all of these sort of things, and you can bring them in your private beliefs into your discussions you have in the workplace. But if it would end up with a discussion where you had to justify what you were doing because of a verse in the Bible, and I don't think that is relevant any more than for Mr. Mogra it is relevant for him to have to find a justification in the Quran for charity. He should not have to find a justification in the Quran for charity or for kindness or any of these noble instincts which you cite as well. That is just not relevant in the workplace.
But can I say, Douglas, you know, I hate to say this, but I think in a way your view is slightly dated, because as I read the workplace, what's happened is, first of all, people brought ethnicity, and they said there should be no discrimination on grounds of race. Then they said there should be no discriminations on ground of gender. Then they said there should be no discriminations on ground of disability. Then they said no discrimination on grounds of sexual preference. And I think what's been happening in the last 15, 20 years, certainly in America and certainly here, is that people have become excited about the fact there shouldn't be discrimination on the basis of religion either, and therefore the workplace should be there to accommodate itself as much as possible two people's religious views.
No, because the difference is that the point about the equal rights on those and equal rights in employment was that they do exactly the same job as everyone else. The point with the religious argument in the workplace is the fact that people are asking for special dispensation, time off in certain things, not doing the whole job that other people have to do, working in a supermarket but not selling that product, selling this one. In other words, doing something different from everyone else. The point of the equal rights legislation you cite is that they did the same thing as everybody else.
Well, in a moment I want to discuss some of the very specific cases that have arisen in the last year, but let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing religion in the workplace. Have employers a responsibility to make allowances for the religious convictions of their employees, and should employees bring those convictions into work? With me are Ibrahim Mogra, Lord Brian Griffiths and Douglas Murray. Sadi Mahmood is a British-born Muslim who married a man from Pakistan. She brought him to live in this country, and as a result of his experience working in an English supermarket, she formed an organisation called Noble Cam to encourage better understanding of religious sensitivities in the workplace. I asked her what difficulties her husband faced when he went to work.
It was more of people found him difficult. He just got on and did his work, which was fine. It was more that the way people behaved towards him started to upset him as time went on.
Give me an illustration.
Well, for example, he'd go and pray. That was agreed by his managers. It was also a policy and a procedure within the workplace. So when he took that time to pray, as agreed, it caused conflict and people started to complain. So on a regular basis, literally every day, he was in the office after praying, and the same managers would call him in and have a word and then let him back on the shop floor. And that can get quite sort of tedious, but also quite resentful. So people would also take his prayer mat and or throw it away or put it on the side or hide it and wouldn't tell him where they'd put it.
It sounds like overt discrimination to me.
Yeah, it was more of misunderstandings and it was more of victimization than discrimination. I think it was a lot to do with ignorance as well.
Now, you took a decision that you were going to join the supermarket. You gave up a good job to do it. Why did you do that?
Because I felt I had a responsibility. I'd married this man from a village. I'd made him leave his entire country and way of life. And from what he was saying when he was coming home, it sounded like people were being racist. So I felt that it was only right that I go and have a look and observe to see what I'd not taught him and why he hadn't sort of integrated, to be honest.
So you went undercover?
I did.
And what happened?
Well, it was really interesting, actually, because when I went through their training, I started to make notes, and it came really evident that training was really ineffective, and the amount of information that people were getting wasn't what they needed to know of how to deal with people of different races, religions, and also for people that were new to the country that had got positions of what they needed to know of how we worked and lived as well.
Now, you made some requests of the managers that on the face of it seemed quite silly.
Yes. Basically, I took Eid off and the manager agreed to it. The following week, I turned around and said to the manager that I need to take Holi off, which is actually a Hindu festival. And the manager agreed and allowed me another day off, which really absolutely shocked me as a professional, because it was her ignorance, but also I think political correctness had a lot to do with it. She was too afraid to question me what Holi was or whether I was allowed to or not. So I stood there on the shop floor for 12 weeks and realised that I've got a solution to this. I could design a training course that could answer the questions that they weren't getting from their training.